Hi everyone, this is Connie. As I said in my introduction video, this first one was going to be about the books I have read in January and February this year, since there was only 3 of them, 2 physical books and 1 ebook. So this should be a pretty short video, and the next one will be the wrap-up of what I've read for March, which was more. So getting right into it, the first book I read was Persuasion by Jane Austen. Now, I've been forced to read books in high school, and the first one that I had to read as an assignment that I love was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And I read that one so quickly, way before the syllabus told us that we had to finish it. I'm not sure why I never read anything else by Jane Austen, so I was excited when my book club that I was in picked Jane Austen to read for January, and Persuasion was the pick. Now, if you don't know, this story is about Anne Elliot, who is your typical middle child where her family, her father, and her siblings pretty much ignore her. And so she views that the rest of the world ignores her too, even though she actually gets along really well with people, and everyone actually likes her the best out of her entire family, but she doesn't realize this. She's just nice, sweet, and solves a lot of people's problems. They all come to her with her problems. 8 years ago, she started a romance and actually became engaged to a naval officer named Frederick Wentworth. She was talked out of that engagement by her friend Lady Russell because she knew that her father would not approve of the marriage because he deemed that military men were a lower class than he was, so very much a class situation going on there. She comes across him 8 years later, which is when the book starts, and he is now a naval captain and very wealthy. And the status of military men in society there has been raised, but her father pretty much has the same opinions as he did before, where he just does not view them as worthy. So her friend tries to convince her again to not start up a romance with him, and she thinks he probably doesn't even love her anymore because it has been 8 years. The thing that's also funny is that her family has gone bankrupt in this time, or they're on the verge of bankruptcy, so they have to rent out their house. They have to go and stay in a smaller apartment in the city, and they used to have this house in the country. And so during all this, there's a lot of commentary on Jane Austen's part about how snobbish people are about different class levels and how she kind of finds it ridiculous. And she also talks about, there's a lot of feminist talk too, which I really enjoyed. She talks about a lot of double standards, which existed at the time, and surprisingly, not surprisingly, some of them still exist today. So I really enjoyed her commentary on society's view on class and also on women in general, and how she wrapped it all up into this romance story. So even if you probably weren't interested in what she had to say about society, you can still just follow the romance. And she's just pretty funny in general. So I recommend that book. The second book I read, oh wait, before I get to that one, I also just want to talk about my book that I destroyed. So this was all, I had this plastic cover on it, and it started coming off the back of it. It was barely on it at all, so I started peeling it away, and it peeled off the back great. And then it got to this part, it just started ripping the book, so I had to stop. So this much is a little plastic covering that's on top of the book, and then here's the rest of it. So I messed up my book. The next book that I read, you can see that, Dragonfly and Amber, the second book in the Outlander series by Diane Galbadon. I swear I watched earlier how to pronounce her name and I've already forgotten. So I'm probably mispronouncing it. Well, it's the second book in the Outlander series. I'm not typically a romance person, even though I did just talk about Jane Austen that had romance in it, and now going into this one, but I was convinced to read Outlander last year after years of one of my good friends and my mother telling me that these books were great and I should read them. And so I finally did, and I really got caught up in the adventure and the historical fiction aspect of this woman, Claire Randall, who is an English woman in 1945, who also used to be a combat nurse during the war, and she is vacationing in Scotland with her husband who's an historian and going through a lot of historical areas on their vacation that's fun for him and not necessarily for her, when she touches some stones and travels back into 18th century Scotland, where she meets Jamie Fraser, who is this hunky Scottish guy, and because she thinks she's just stuck in this time and has no clue how to get back, she ends up falling in love with this guy. So that's pretty much the first book. I don't want to get too spoilery about what happens in the second one, especially if you haven't read the first one, but basically I'll just say that Claire and Jamie continue their adventures. They have to leave Scotland for things that happen in the end of the first book, and so they flee to France. And while there, they decide to try to convince Charles Stuart to not have a Jacobite uprising, because since Claire's from the future, she knows that it fails. But they have to convince him without telling him why and be pretty sneaky about it. So that's the setup for this book. So they spend some time in Paris, and they also spend some time in Scotland later on. This book starts off with these bookends that actually take place back in 1945. And the part in the beginning is really long before you actually get into the adventure of Claire and Jamie again. And it doesn't flow all that well. So the first book kind of ends on this cliffhanger almost, and then it takes you almost, I don't know how many pages it was, but it felt like it was 100 pages before we actually got back into the action again. So from having a cliffhanger and then suddenly traveling to 1945 and going, what's happening in the current time, just really slowed the reading down. So it was kind of a slog to get through when the action started up again. And even when you get to them landing in France and getting set up in Paris, there's just a lot of details going on, and it's not really that exciting for a bit. But then stuff finally starts happening. So I read the middle part of this book pretty quickly. And when they get over to Scotland, there's the war is starting, and there's some day-to-day minutia that's happening with war, and that gets kind of boring to read. But then finally some more stuff starts happening. And even when at the very end of the time back in 18th century Scotland, and even when it ends the book in 1945 again, all of that is really interesting. And then it ends on another cliffhanger that makes you immediately want to jump right into the third book. But I'm going to hold off on that for right now. I read the first book right before the first season of Outlander on Starz began, and this one I wanted to finish up for the second season that starts next month, so I'm all ready to go for that. And I did also hear that they are actually reordering what happens in the story in the show so that the bookends from 1945 that happened at the beginning and the end of the book, I think they're actually supposed to be happening at the end of the season, so it's probably going to flow a lot better in the series what I would have liked to happen in the book, because I think I would have been more interested in what I read in the beginning of the book if I had read it later on. When I had read it, I just didn't care about what was happening, so that would have been my suggestion for when she originally wrote this. Now I'll go on to my third book, which is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And this book is framed as a letter to his adolescent son, and he's a black man, writing to his son who is crying over realizing when one young black man has been shot by a police. He's an unarmed black man shot by a police, and it's just been found not guilty in a trial. His son is really upset by it because he had no indication that this could possibly happen. So this is written as a letter to his son of his struggles of how to raise his son differently than how he was raised, but still letting him not be so naive in this world where just because of the color of his skin he can be treated differently. So when Ta-Nehisi was younger, both his parents and grandparents raised him pretty much to fear other people. Fear people in his neighborhood, fear white people, just fear people knowing that they're going to try to like get him, like being pulled over for no reason and racial profiling, and they always wanted him to be prepared, so he kind of lived with this fear, and he didn't really want to do that to his son, but at the same time he wants to prepare them for when these things are inevitably going to happen. So this book is really heartbreaking. It really puts you in the shoes of him and the other people he knew growing up. He also makes historical references. It's something that I think everybody should read. It's only 152 pages. It's a really quick read. He writes in a very conversational style, and it's just a really excellent book. This has been featured prominently at Powell's here in Portland ever since I think it came out, and it's still always on display whenever I go into the bookstore. So I had it on my list to read for a while, and then my book club picked it for February, so this is what I read, and I just highly recommend this book to anyone. It's a quick read. It's only hard in the way that it just makes your heart hurt when you read about it, but I do recommend it. And those are the books that I read for January, February, and I did also want to do one last thing before I go. I don't know if I'm going to be able to start it this month because I'm almost done with the books I plan to read in March, but if I do get time, I want to. Oh, look, it has a little Christmas holly because this was the Christmas bucket that I'm repurposing. I wanted to pick from my to-be-read pile, and that's going to be the next book I read after I finish the one that I'm reading right now. So it could happen in March or it could be in April. So right now I am picking The Crimson Petal and the White. So that book is over there somewhere that I'll find, and I will read that. So that will be either in the next video or the video after that, whenever I finish it. Alright, and thank you for watching. If you have any comments or questions or anything, please post them down in the comments below. And I'll also put links to my Goodread reviews that I'm going to post for all of these books. I'll put those links down below in the description. And thank you for watching.